Okay, hello everybody. Today we are going to continue working with Communist Manifesto. Yesterday I stopped on the point of introduction to manifesto. We read through only a couple of pages, and we will continue today. So before we move on, I'll quickly recap what we have gone through for the previous stream. I have my notes here with me. So the main points so far were the document has been altering between talking about how the world has changed and how the life of people changed, especially in regards to bourgeoisie rise to power. Now, I've been thinking again and again about the phrase that you can see now on the screen. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. That's a beautiful phrase that kept me going, and I couldn't wait to start this thing again because I feel like this document has a great value as a not only as a historical and philosophical and political document, but also as a as exemplar literature work, right? So those strong uh, metaphors, they are just incredible to me, and I feel like there are lots of them here, but this one is like the best at the moment so far. Uh, so yeah, the talk was that the epoch of bourgeoisie brought with itself ever-changing environment. Nothing stays constant forever, and yeah, this is where this phrase comes from. And through bourgeoisie power, their rise to power, they changed the production and consumption in the whole world and added some sort of cosmopolitan character to everything, both in material production and in intellectual, right? And everyone just became like laboring for money. That's it. So, the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communications, draws all, even the most barbarian nations into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. So everybody has to yield to a bourgeoisie way of life, right? It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what is called civilization into their midst. An example, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie, by its efficiency, compels all world to surrender itself and become more like the civilization from which bourgeoisie came from, right? So they breed a similar kind of world that they live in. And now we come to the new material. So the bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries depend on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the east on the west. That's a rough sentence. Okay, so as the bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated population, centralized the means of production, and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. Mhm. So the idea is here that not only bourgeoisie and their way of life made the towns. I'm not sure if that is the main idea here, because towns, by by its nature, towns, cities by its nature, uh, should probably be the centers of their countries, right? So probably this is not the main uh, idea here. The main idea is the dependence of other less developed, let's say that countries, dependent on the more developed nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the east on the west. This definitely deserves a couple of sentences in the notes. So I'm gonna add here. Uh, the bourgeoisie made the less developed countries dependent on more developed ones. Okay. And what comes after that has a imminent connection with the previous paragraph. So mhm. Again, it's about centralization. So the first part of this paragraph tells how their countries became civilized, and even more so, centralized. And even more so, the centralization goes to the whole world, where less developed countries play the role of the uh, rural side to the towns, like of more developed countries, right? This goes wrong, but I'm sure that it's quite clear when we read this thing. Centralization goes as far as not only it made cities within countries, the their life centers, but also yes, this is way better. Okay, so the population has agglomerated, everything become centralized, both in terms of political centralization and well, actual centralization. Uh, and separate uh-huh. So I guess this tells the story, the tale of a German country, right? The Germany, which, as far as I know, was lots of separate provinces, and they they speak more or less the same language. They spoke more or less the same language, but for a very long time it been very, as I say here, loosely connected. But with I guess that this is a probably historical note. This refers to uh, the union of German provinces. I'm not sure. I don't want to spread non-truth. Okay, so the centralization went, and now we have loosely connected provinces lumped together into one nation. One code of laws, one code of national class interests, frontier, and one customs tariffs. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivations, colonization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had ever a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? So yeah, the bourgeoisie, they are extremely efficient and productive. We see then the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of this means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. So the previous means of production and trade, they came from feudal society. The bourgeoisie inherited it. And at some point, the modern world and the way of life that was brought with bourgeoisie became incompatible with this way of those means of productions and of trade. And so they were destroyed. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted in it, and the economic and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeois and its rule. It is enough to mention that commercial crises that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on its trial, each time more threateningly. That's a lot. In this crisis, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In this crisis, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered. And so soon as they become these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over this crisis? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. That's a huge paragraph. Okay, so we have to retrace the steps. So this is like huge paragraph that feels like a conclusion to a more broader line of thought. So a bourgeoisie with their efficient way of production revolutionized the world so much that they conquered basically less developed countries, not by the force, but by very cheap commodities, very accessible commodities. And the way of life that has been brought with bourgeoisie swayed less developed countries into the ways of the bourgeoisie, right? They created colossal productive forces, and at some point, as bourgeoisie based their advances on the, let's say, ways of the feudal society, more concretely, the means of production and of exchange of feudal society. At some point, their own way became incompatible with feudal inheritance, right? and so they destroyed it. Well, I don't think I understand history that well to truly understand this process. I cannot remember any facts that I learned about history of feudal society and how it transitioned to bourgeoisie at the moment. But okay, so far so good. And now the authors come to the conclusion that a similar movement is going on before our eyes. So feudal societies, if we look at the situation from the eyes of the feudal societies and maybe their nobility, we see that feudal society was put into a crisis by existence of bourgeoisie and its rapid development. And now modern bourgeois society with its relations of production, of exchange and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many decades past, of history of industry and commerce is but a history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeois and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crisis that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on its trial, each time more threateningly. In this crisis, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces, are periodically destroyed. In this crisis, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Yes, I can feel like this really does sound like an absurd. Their society is based on continuous production, and at some point there is no more demand, right? And if the production was too big, as as they say now, too big to fail, maybe it's something like that. So as they come to such point, the existence of the bourgeoisie, or perhaps parts of it, are at stake. Okay, so society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. Why barbarism? It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered. And so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. Okay, I can see what they're talking about. They mention, for example, creation of productive forces. And forces, by definition, productive forces are proletariat, right? Too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces are at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. They became too powerful, and then they are fettered. But as soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder to the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. So it's what is this all about? Is this about the well? At this point, I can only guess what it's completely about because I'd like to have an example here what they are talking about. Maybe I'm too much focused on the paragraph at hand, but I'd like to really understand it before we move forward. Okay, so probably what are the conditions where overproduction means that bourgeois society cannot become more developed? It's when the development is so dependent on selling the products so that if there is no demand, they cannot sell it, but the productive force don't want to go away, like they can't just close the manufacturing. Maybe something like that. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over this crisis? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive force. So probably this is about the closing the manufacture, modern industries, like modern at the time, contemporary industries. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby these crises are prevented. Mm-hmm. So it says that the crises are absurd, and the means of dealing with this crisis are absurd as well, and they not solve any problem. They just postpone the resolution, right? The crises that are on their way are going to be far worse than those that are happening at the moment. Mm-hmm. Okay, that because obviously because new markets are cannot be conquered reliably all the time because we live on the not endless planet. There are limits on the markets. More thorough exploitation of old markets. I can understand that not only exploitation but maybe efficiency. Destruction of a mass of productive forces. That is something that probably talks about the closing of the factories. Okay. Well, let's move on. That was a hard paragraph. So I guess this deserves a new note, right? To remember. So as the feudal society was put at risk, was extinct. Has gone through extinction. The the bourgeoisie are finding themselves in a similar situation. The crises are absurd over production and the means of dealing with such crises are are let's call it questionable as well. They rely on finding new markets, exploitation of the old ones, or destruction of the current productive forces. Okay. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. So yes, I got it correctly. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that brings death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, meaning capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed, a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. That hits close to home. Uh, Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for maintenance and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to the cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of working hours, by the increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of machinery, etc. Yeah, the last two paragraphs are very important. So the idea is that laborers became a commodity that is exposed to all fluctuations of market and everything that comes with the competition. And also I need to look up the word. We see whatever.
Vicissitude.
Vicissitude. All right. A change or circumstances or fortune, typically one that is unwelcomed or unpleasant. Alternation between opposite or contrasting things. Okay. Got it. So the next part is quite strong. The workman became an appendage of the machine. It doesn't have any grasp on the whole production line. All the charm of the craft became unreachable for the laborer in such times. The division of labor. Yes, I actually I can kind of relate to that. I can kind of relate to that because at some point, probably all of us, or maybe the majority of us, felt like they're just like the smallest piece of the greater machine, and at some point they could feel like they are like, well, as they say, appendage of the machine. That is very powerful. And the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of machinery, etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into a great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aims, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. So the structure is it oppressive? And the more they, as if the idea behind those words, I think, is that the more the manufacturer and the system swears loyalty to efficiency and to the final gain, the more dirty their tricks are becoming, right? So they can cut expenses and something like that. The more hateful and the more embittering it becomes. The less the skill and the exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use, according to their age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash, that he is set upon by the other portion of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen, generally the handcraftsmen and peasants, all this sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalist, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by the new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried by the individual laborers, then by the workpeople of a factory, then by the operative of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois condition of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workman of the Middle Age. That is very interesting, read. That is very interesting. Uh, Full disclosure, I read this not because I have made up my mind, but rather I am trying to make up my mind about this in the process. And what I can say is the same thing that I had started my stream with, is that this is an extremely interesting piece of literature, at least, at the very least. So I am sort of enamored with the choice of words and what is the structure of the story. So far, what I can see here is that it's more or less faceless description of a set of events, and what I think it has to come with some more specific uh, more specific description of concrete certain events, like when such thing happened, how that happens, maybe some names, because now it doesn't have any sources in the text, and maybe this will come later. But yeah, uh, that's a very strong read. So I think today we have gone through another 2 pages. Yes, that's right. We have gone through another 2 pages, and there is no need to hurry up unnecessarily. I think we will eventually come through the whole documents, piece by piece, paragraph by paragraph. We will learn and um, make up our minds in the process. So to everybody who's watching, thank you for that, and I think I'll see you next time. Bye bye.